Welcome to part 2. So our learning objectives for part 2 are to detail the pathways for short and long-term stress, noting the hormones, glands, and cellular cascades involved, and to describe how our bodies maintain blood sugar homeostasis. And then for each of those systems, explain the outcomes of hypo or hyper secretion, when we make too little or too much. Let's first overview the glands in the endocrine system. So as you can see, there are lots of glands here. We're going to be talking about just a few of them. So for stress, we'll look at the effect of the hypothalamus to the pituitary to our adrenal glands sitting here on top of the kidneys. And then for blood sugar, we'll look at the pancreas. Glands, the adrenal glands make steroid hormones. So that's the class of hormones we're talking about here. They're located on top of the kidneys. They've got a glandular cortex, so an glandular cortex, an outer layer that really just makes hormones. And then the inner part has some nervous tissue. So that's where we're going to have that interplay with the sympathetic nervous system. The cortex has 3 layers to it, and each one makes its own class of hormones. So we'll be focusing on these top 2 layers, the one that makes mineralocorticoids and then glucocorticoids, and then we'll talk about the medulla, that center that has that nervous function. So the first part we're going to talk about are our mineralocorticoids. So this is made in the outer layer. The main one there is aldosterone, and aldosterone is going to target our kidneys. Now for AMP1, we haven't talked about our kidneys, but what you need to understand is that kidneys help make urine, and they do that by filtering out your blood. So they're going to take almost all the blood, will go through the kidney, it'll pull out almost everything, and then put back into the blood the stuff it wants and pee out the stuff it doesn't want. So with aldosterone, the kidney will be told, oh, okay, you should reclaim more sodium, put more sodium back in the blood, and put more potassium into the urine. So more sodium into the blood, potassium into the urine. And just know that for this class, all you need to understand is water will follow the sodium. And so with more sodium going into the blood, we'll get more water into the blood. We'll then have more blood volume, which means more blood pressure. This is stimulated by low salt in the blood. So if we have low salt in the blood, we'll release aldosterone and we'll get more salt in our blood. Works out. That's the direct stimulation. It can also be stimulated by a hormone released from the pituitary gland in response to stress, ACTH. And so this is the figure from your book. Your book puts a lot of other details in there that I don't think are helpful. So if we have decreased sodium in the blood, we're going to directly stimulate our adrenal gland to release aldosterone, which will tell our kidney, hey, absorb some of that salt and excrete some of that potassium, reabsorb some of that salt. So the salt and the water will follow into our blood. We'll have increased blood volume and increased blood pressure. Now for stress, however, that'll tell our hypothalamus to release corticotropin releasing hormone, which will tell our anterior pituitary to release ACTH, which will then tell our adrenal gland release aldosterone, which will tell our kidneys reabsorb some more sodium, water will follow, we'll excrete more potassium, and we'll increase blood volume and blood pressure. This is why if you're stressed out, you gotta watch out for your blood pressure. You gotta manage that stress. The middle layer of our adrenal glands, this is where we make our glucocorticoids, things like cortisol and cortisone. And this is our body's response to long-term stress, and it works to try to resist that long-term stressor. And it does this mainly by increasing blood sugar. It thinks you're stressed out, your cells have a lot going on, let's give them fuel. And to do this, it'll eventually break down fats and proteins. And in the positive, we're going to decrease the edema and pain we get from inflammation. But in the long-term negative, we might actually shut down some of our immune system and make us more liable to get sick. Glucocorticoids have targets all throughout the body because of this kind of general function. And they're also stimulated by ACTH from our hypothalamus pituitary axis. Now, what happens if they get imbalanced? So if we don't make enough adrenal cortex hormones, we can get something called Addison's disease, which leads to dehydration. Again, we're not getting enough water into our blood, and a decreased ability to handle stressors. We're not making that cortisol. If we have too much, on the other hand, this is where we can have things like hyperaldosteronism, which is a lot of that aldosterone is made. We're going to have really high blood pressure. We're going to swell up because of all the salt in our blood, in our body, and all the water in our body. And that excretion of potassium can affect our heart because Your heart needs potassium. Now, if you have hypersecretion in the center of the cortex, that's where you have high cortisol. This can lead to something called Cushing's disease, usually caused by a tumor in that region. It leads to things like edemas or swelling, so a moon face and a buffalo hump, and again, that high blood pressure. Let's talk about the center, the medulla of our adrenal gland. This is the nervous tissue part. So it's stimulated by our sympathetic nervous system, and it releases catecholamines, epinephrine and norepinephrine. Epinephrine, think EpiPens, and these work with the sympathetic nervous system. So the same targets that our sympathetic has to increase our heart rate and increase blood flow in our muscles, we're going to see them here. That again, that fight or flight response. And this works with it to prolong the effect of our fight or flight response, but is still part of that alarm stage or the short-term stress response. So let's look at them side by side. So in the short term, stress is going to tell our hypothalamus to send that sympathetic signal to our adrenal medulla, which will release the catecholamines, epinephrine and norepinephrine, that will have that fight or flight response. Increased heart rate, increased blood pressure. We're going to make blood glucose rise, dilate our bronchioles to take in all that oxygen, and change our blood flow pattern to decrease the digestion and increase alertness and blood flow to our muscles and increase our general metabolic rate. If it keeps going, however, our body's like, we got to do something. This is a long-term stressor. So in the resistance phase, this first part is the alarm phase. In the second part, the resistance phase, the hypothalamus will signal with the corticotropin-releasing hormone to the anterior pituitary, which will release ACTH, which will stimulate the adrenal cortex to make mineralocorticoids, aldosterone, and our glucocorticoids, cortisol. The aldosterone goes to our kidneys, tells it to retain the sodium. Water follows. We get high blood volume, high blood pressure. The cortisol will turn our proteins and our fats into sugars and break it all down for energy. Going to increase our blood sugar though and suppress our immune system, which sometimes is a good thing, especially if we're talking about inflammation and pain, but is a bad thing in the long term. That's why if you're really stressed out for a long period of time, you're going to get sick. Manage your stress. Okay, let's talk about the last little bit of hormones here, the pancreatic islets. These regulate blood glucose levels. They're located in your abdomen, and the hormone-producing tissue here is scattered throughout the pancreas, whose main job is to make enzymes. So the islets act like mini organs in a bigger organ, and they make insulin and glucagon. So this is what that looks like. Again, we've got enzyme-secreting cells, and we also then have scattered throughout it these alpha and beta cells. The alpha cells make glucagon, which tells your liver to turn the long polymers of glucose called glycogen down into their monomeric form of glucose and release it into the blood. And this is stimulated when you have low blood sugar. The beta cells make insulin, which tell your body cells to take up glucose, and it's stimulated by rising blood glucose. And again, this operates with negative feedback. So this is what it looks like. You eat a sugary meal, say you have some Cinnamon Toast Crunch. That rise in blood sugar will tell your pancreas to release insulin, which will tell the cells of your body to take up glucose. It also tells the liver to turn excess glucose into those long chains of glycogen, and it brings your blood glucose down, turning off the release of insulin. Now, say it's been a while, you're fasting maybe, or you just forgot to eat lunch. Low blood sugar will tell your pancreas, hey, it's time to make glucagon, and you will make glucagon, and it will tell the liver, break down those stores of glucose, we need it, and the glucose will be released, raising your blood glucose, turning off the glucagon release. The most common example of this system gone awry is diabetes mellitus, otherwise known typically as just as diabetes, high blood sugar. So what happens if we have so much blood sugar that insulin can't keep up with it? Well, that glucose will spill from our blood into our urine. There becomes so much glucose in the blood, we can't pull all of it back in, we're going to pee some of it out. Water will follow. If this keeps happening, we're going to not have enough energy. So if we're peeing out all of our glucose, we'll then start breaking down our proteins. This can lead to ketoacidosis of the blood. And the three major symptoms here are polyuria, so you're peeing out all that glucose, you're peeing a lot. Polydipsia, which is thirsty, you're not getting enough water because you're peeing so much. And then polyphagia, you're not using blood glucose, so you're hungry. There are two major types. Type 2 is the adult onset. This is where you're making insulin, but for some reason your body is not responding to it. You become insulin resistant. And there are drugs that work to turn on those beta cells and increase the sensitivity a little bit. Type 1 is a juvenile onset. This is considered like an immune disorder where you're just not making insulin. And so you're going to need an insulin pump or insulin injections regularly.